The simplest life form has about 267,000 bits of information in its genome. Human life has over 6 billion bits of information in the genome. If you use the formulas that have been around now for a few years for figuring out the functional information quantity, functional information, using those two figures, says that the probability of forming the simplest life is 10 to the 300 millionth times more probable than forming human life. So we've looked at the simplest life before. Well, forming a human is 10 to the 300 millionth times more unlikely than that happening. There really is no mechanism from information science that can produce any net information increase, because any increase in functionality is offset by a decrease in functionality. For example, in humans' ancient history, at some point, a gene on the hemoglobin gene mutated so that sickle cell anemia developed. Well, sickle cell anemia sounds kind of bad, but on the other hand, it has provided a selective advantage for people living in some areas of Africa. Why is that? The Plasmodium parasite that causes malaria can't invade the mutation, the cells with the mutation that causes sickle cell anemia. So what does that mean? Well, people that live in high malaria vicinities are better off having sickle cell anemia and having a lower oxygen carrying capability of the red blood cells than they are dying from malaria. And so therefore, they have an increase. One of the things that is often portrayed, back in 1975, a bacterium was discovered in Japan that was able to digest nylon. Well, nylon wasn't invented even until 1935. And so how did this bacterium develop the capability of digesting nylon? And people use that as an example of, new information. Well, when you look at what happened in that gene of that bacterium, it looks like what happened. Remember the coding along there? You have various codons. Well, if one of the nucleotide, one of the bases is missing, what happens? The codons get shifted. It's called a frame shift. Okay? So what happens is by doing that frame shift, the bacterium developed the capability of digesting nylon. Sounds like a great case for new information. But the problem is, when that happened, the bacterium lost the capability to digest cellulose. So basically, what's more important for a normal bacteria? Being able to digest nylon at about 8% efficiency, or being able to digest cellulose at a fairly high efficiency? And I would contend that the net gain or loss in the genome is not a gain. It's a loss. And you can read about these kinds of things on the web, because a lot of people say, well, mutations can cause information increases. They have not ever shown from the functional information formula that have been around for quite a while that that's the case. And I'll listen to them when they put the pre-mutated and post-mutated genome into the functional information formula and show me that there was a net increase in information. There are a lot of other things that are accounting for moving up the biological tree. One of the more recent ones that just came out this year, at the beginning of the 21st century, molecular cell biology has revealed a dense structure of information processing networks that use the genome as an interactive read-write memory. The natural genetic engineering functions that mediate genome restructuring are activated by multiple stimuli. So you have all these control systems that somehow work out a natural genetic engineering system within every cell. So maybe we should look at that just a little bit, because people for the last several years now, scientists have been acknowledging the picture that we get from Darwinian evolution really can't work. It really is not justified, so there must be something else. And so this is one of the ideas that came up by Shapiro earlier this year, where he says one of the traditional objections to Darwinian gradualism has been that it is too slow and indeterminate a process to account for the natural adaptions, even allowing for long periods of random mutation and selection. Natural genetic engineering employs a combinatorial search process based upon DNA modules that already possess functionality. Such a cognitive component is absent from the conventional evolutionary theory because 19th and 20th century evolutionists were not sufficiently knowledgeable about cellular response and control networks. I find to be very interesting some of the words that are used in Shapiro's analysis. And what he's saying here is that somehow each cell has in it a cognitive component that allows it to predict which mutations would be beneficial later on. So you have genetic engineering says, we can genetically engineer something to produce the qualities that we want. What he's saying is these are a natural happening within the cell. So the cell somehow knows what would be best for it, and so then it can evolve along those lines, because the traditional Darwinian thought is that mutation is simply a random process, and that's followed by selection, which selects for the best of the processes, the results of the mutation. And what he's saying is acknowledged by many scientists now that that doesn't work, and so there must be something else. And so what he's come up with is the natural genetic engineering and some kind of a cognitive capability that a cell possesses. Revisit Darwinianism just a little bit. Earlier this year, in fact just this month, in Nature, the complexity of biology has seemed to grow by orders of magnitude. Biology's new glimpse at a universe of non-coding DNA, what used to be called junk DNA, has been fascinating and befuddling. I don't know if you've heard about junk DNA or not, but junk DNA is the term that was used starting back in the 70s for the 98% of the human genome doesn't code for protein. And therefore, 98% of it was assumed to be junk that was left over from the mutation process of random mutations happening within the DNA structure until some useful gene developed by chance. And so it became known as junk DNA because it was assumed for 20 years that it had no purpose. Well, since then we found that it does indeed have purpose. Life would not be the same at all without this non-coding DNA. Anyway, the signaling information in cells is organized through networks of information rather than discrete pathways. It's infinitely more complex. So perhaps infinitely is a little bit of an overstatement, but basically it is a lot more complex than we can imagine. Back around the turn of the last century, about 1900 or so, cells were thought to be globs of plasm, basically. And it developed into, today we realize that, hey, there's multiple computers networked and sharing memory and communicating with each other, error correction and so forth. People say, well, what about computer simulations and algorithms and so forth, genetic algorithms? Don't they prove that evolution works, Darwinian evolution works? And basically, what we can end up looking at is that everywhere in the apparatus, in the genetic algorithms, appear the scientist's fingerprints. Basically, you don't have a program creating something out of nothing. So the neglect of key factors or unrealistic parameter settings permit conclusions to be claimed which merely reflect what the decision maker intended a priori. So we've looked at a number of different aspects, and so we've seen that, for example, data is functional information only if it has a useful purpose. We've seen that life is incredibly complex and it's information rich beyond what we can even imagine. And what's interesting is that the more we peel back the components of life to look at what's inside, the more complex it becomes. It doesn't get simpler, it gets more complex. So I can ask the question, is information science correct? Can chance produce complex specified information? Information science would say it can't. It can't produce complex specified information by random processes. Can multiple mutational information losses called an overall information gain? Can chance produce codes or formal protocols? Was life's first code simpler than the current codon code? Can chance write prescriptive algorithmic programs and operating systems? Can chance create genetic engineering capability within a cell? Information science would say no to all of those things. And so the scenarios that have been proposed so far have not adequately addressed information. You get the naturalistic approach to something, but it has largely ignored the information theory, the information processes, the information science aspect of life. So the assertions for the origin of life and the origin of species really need some scientific verification, rather than simply accepting those kinds of things as some kind of truth that's handed down. Perhaps other avenues would be more fruitful in yielding scientific results. And the last thing that I want to mention is that there's a place in science for speculation, because that's how ideas are put forth and tried out. But speculation in science should not be too widespread so that the public gets the idea that that's somehow scientific truth. Because that, almost everything I learned in my first Ph.D. work and prior to it, in the American Chemical Society, from molecules to man, has been debunked by science. And that's important to know that the things that I used to think were true, I found out later are not. And so I think we need to be careful as scientists what kind of information we release to the public. It's certainly valid science to pursue these things as a scientist, but be real careful about what you say to the public, because the public tends to look highly at scientists. Well, if a scientist says it must be true, then it must be true. And that isn't always the case.